flat in the main building. And his name was, of course, Werner Heisenberg. And it's during those 2 years, 1925, 26, and the beginning of 1927, that Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr worked together to create quantum physics and quantum mechanics. That's the mathematics that describes what happens at a subatomic level. Why did he move from here in 1931, you ask? It's because he got real lucky. He got awarded the honorary mansion at the Carlsberg Brewery. This is the brewer's old house. Still there, you can still go and see it if you go and visit Carlsberg, which I would recommend to anybody. He lived there the rest of his life in absolute palatial house until his death in 1962. I only have one photograph again from when this house was, when this room was his office, and he stood between these two chairs here. He's being photographed from the door over here, and pretty much everything that is in this room is still here. There are a few additions. We've got some photographs from after Bohr's death. He obviously wasn't an egomaniac with a portrait of himself above there. So why is there an institute at all in little Denmark, in Copenhagen, right at the end of Europe? That story starts in 1911. And it starts with a rather sad but ironic tale about Niels Bohr's father. Niels Bohr's father was professor of physiology. If any of you were interested in where Niels Bohr grew up, it's the Medical Museum in Copenhagen. You can go and see it. His father probably would have won the Nobel Prize. He discovered what you call the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect says that the hemoglobin in your blood will not take up oxygen if there's too much carbon dioxide or monoxide. And this is where the irony comes in. He was 55 years old. He had a flat next to his laboratory. He came home and he said his last words to his wife, "I think I should give up smoking." Oh. I'm sorry, we have to compete with the traffic outside because otherwise it gets way too warm in here. 3 weeks later, Niels Bohr had to deliver his doctoral thesis. It's called The Electron Theory of Metals. He has 2 examiners from Copenhagen University. He has also run into 2 problems because these 2 examiners don't understand a word he's written. He still gets his doctorate, so that's maybe if you ever want to get a PhD, write something they've got no chance of understanding, they won't dare mark it against you. But he's lost his access to one of only 3 laboratories of a modern standard in the whole of Denmark. 1, the physiology department, that was his father's and he got to use it. 2, the Polytechnic, now the Technical University of Denmark, but he's at the university, so he comes at the bottom of the list for using that. The 3rd laboratory, any guesses? I'm guessing there's no Danes here.
Oh no.
Oh, there are. No. You don't know, you should be ashamed of yourself. It's Carlsberg. Now, for all of those of you who don't come from Denmark, and those of you just as surprised even though you do, Carlsberg is where the pH system was developed for telling acids from alkalis. Later in the 1950s, and I'm going to come back to that, carbon-14 dating. Checking carbon atoms so that you can tell how old an archaeological remain is. So, they're not just doing that. Niels Bohr, when he presents his doctoral thesis, The Electron Theory of Metals, therefore needs to go abroad to continue. So first of all, and when I'm finished, I'm going to leave a little time that you can go around and photograph anything you like and check it out. There is a picture here under Galileo of a man with a fantastic walrus moustache. And his name was J.J. Thomson. J.J. Thomson is the man who discovered the electron. Logical. However, he and Bohr don't get on. His idea of what an atom looks like versus what Bohr finally comes up with could not be more different. He comes up with what he calls the plum pudding model. So if you've ever seen those Christmas cards from England at Christmas, that round thing, and it's the positive atom pudding with the electrons, the negative plums, sitting in it, held together by a mysterious substance that we hadn't detected at that time because it doesn't exist. Bohr's atom is mostly empty space. So Bohr comes in, tells him all about his new theory, which contradicts, 20 years of his working life. And after that, Thomson is not too eager to talk to Niels Bohr again. This is a massive disappointment for Bohr. He basically comes to the point where he's writing letters home that start, "Don't worry, but," which is always a good sign. However, just as he's starting to do this, he's invited to a dinner party in Manchester. For those of you who don't know Great Britain, that's about 150 miles, 300 kilometres, give or take, north of Cambridge, where he is. It's a colleague of his father's who invites him, and at the table right next to Niels Bohr is the guy you can see above the fireplace there, Ernest Rutherford, New Zealander, who is working on the structure of atoms at that very time at Manchester University. They get talking, then they get writing. By Christmas, New Year, 1911 to 12, they've decided that Niels Bohr should spend his third term in Great Britain, in Manchester. Now, whatever happens in Manchester happens very quickly. I say whatever, I am a historian, I am not a physicist. I am very dependent on what people write down, and in this period of his life particularly, Niels Bohr can be very frustrating to work with. For example, he arrives on the 30th of April, I can tell that from, we still have the tickets. On the 27th of May, he writes a letter home to his brother, which starts off promising and says, "I think things are going in the right direction." Doesn't mention anything else. 19th of June, he writes home, the first sentence is, "I think I may have discovered something about the structure of the atom," and the rest of the letter is just, "Don't tell anybody," which drives you crazy. However, on the 6th of July, he turns up at Ernest Rutherford's office. He's just about to go home to Denmark, and he's got 17 scraps of paper with him, which we call the Manchester Memorandum. It's a very fine title for such scrappy bits of paper. What's important about the pieces of paper is he draws the Bohr atom for the first time. Hydrogen and helium. So you have the nucleus in the centre, you have electrons orbiting the atom. 1 for hydrogen, 2 for helium. And what you would not do in physics now, because we know it's not the case, is he's helpfully put a little arrow to show which way they go. However, if you take that little arrow out of the diagram, you can use that as a model for the atom today. And this is the basis of what Bohr wins the Nobel Prize for some 10 years later. Rutherford says, "Go publish," and then there is a back and forth correspondence where Rutherford is saying, "Love it, but can you be more concise?" As I will get back to in a short while, Niels Bohr, if you put a gun to his head, could not be concise. So in 1913, 3 papers are published on the structure of atoms and molecules. And that's only 2 subjects, right? It's 3 shorter papers instead of 2 longer ones, and that's the simple explanation for that. Do you want a chair? Sure? Okay. I don't want you getting uncomfortable. Anyway, he goes back to Britain originally to get married. He goes back to Denmark to get married, but he can't get a job in Denmark. And it's really one of these things that the old professor was just about to retire, and one guy had been stood in the wings waiting for 20 years to take that job, and he got it. Niels Bohr did not. He gets a lecturer's position, hates it, so he goes back to Great Britain for 2 years. And I said about not writing things down. There's 2 years worth of correspondence with various people, especially his brother. Niels Bohr arrives in Britain 3 weeks after World War I is declared, and as far as I can tell, comes back to Denmark in 1916, just as the Battle of Jutland is raging between the German and British navies just off the Danish coast. Never mentions World War One once in any of those letters. So, the only reason you can tell there's a war going on is it says opened by the censor on every single MO home. And at one point, I should point out, during lockdown, I decided to do one of the jobs that you never get time to do otherwise. I translated all of Niels and his brother Harold's letters to each other into English, which was going fine until in 1916 they passed a law saying that all letters had to be written in English so the censor could actually read them. That's fine for Niels, but his brother Harold studied in Germany, and probably translating Harold's English into English took me at least as long as all the rest of the letters put together. The reason he comes back to Denmark is it's embarrassment. He is an international sensation. There's been very little pushback to his theory. Nobody seems to be calling it into question. And he hasn't got a job in Denmark. This is a national embarrassment. So the government decided that as well as a professor of physics, we need a professor of theoretical physics. And they gave him one office and one assistant, this guy with the John Lennon glasses on here, whose name was Hendrik Hamers. He was a Dutchman. And they work out of that office for the next 5 years whilst this institute is being built. This is a really good piece of fortune on Niels Bohr's part. He has a school friend. Now, some of you, have we any physicists in here today? Oh, okay. You know Niels Bohr's son, right?
Yes.
He won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
Do you want to have a go at his name?
I put it downstairs in the plaque.
Yeah, AAGE in Danish gives you the boy's name, or I don't make the rules, that's just how it is. But he's called after this school friend, Or Belen, who Niels Bohr's known since he was 7 years old, who happily works for Copenhagen City Council to get in this plot of land. Then the government say, right, we'll pay for the buildings, we will pay for the wages, but you'll have to equip it privately. This, on the face of it, is going to be difficult. But people start sending money in all across Denmark, right from Mr. and Mrs. Jensen right down to 10 kroner, right up to the Carlsberg Foundation. And thank goodness for the Carlsberg Foundation, because in 1918, peace breaks out in Europe, which is great for everybody, but not for the Danish economy. We have been supplying Germany with foodstuffs for 4 years at massively inflated prices. Our economy went to hell overnight. The next thing that happens is there was a massive argument between the king and the government about where the border should be with Germany. The government accepted the League of Nations ruling that it was where it is in Schleswig-Holstein today. The king did not and fired the government. This caused a massive general strike, near revolution, including the builders. So some of you were stood outside for quite a while before you came in here, and you must have read the date on the main building above the guy who was sleeping. 1920. It's not true. It opened on the 3rd of March 1921. They had to cancel an opening day in May 1920, August 1920, October 1920, and finally it opened on the 3rd of March 1921. We talk about the laws of physics, this is more the laws of Murphy. There was the political crisis, the economic crisis, and then Spanish flu. Now this is kind of ironic because it was 100 years to the day, the 3rd of March 2021, that I have to give a lecture here during Corona. I never saw another person. I went into the lecture hall, was talked to through a speaker, had to look at a camera, and then I was told to go away again, and I never saw anybody all day. The stress of this is palpable on Niels Bohr because I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a photograph which is supposed to be the highest collection of IQs ever collected together. And it's taken in Belgium in 1921. Niels Bohr is not on it. He should have been, but he was at home on his doctor's orders, suffering from stress. So that will give you an idea of how stressful opening this institute was. But enough of the problems. 1922 is the golden year and the start of everything. Niels Bohr wins the Nobel Prize. He's also got an old colleague working here, and it's this guy here with the shiny head. He becomes our second Nobel Prize winner. His name was George Hevesy. And Hevesy and Bohr had worked together in Manchester before the war with Rutherford. And Hevesy has had terrible troubles since World War I getting a job. He was a Hungarian Jewish nobleman who was also a physical chemist. He got a job at the end of the war in Budapest as professor. However, he was fired because the communists came to power because they did not want an aristocrat as the professor. He manages to claw this job back again during the course of 1920, only to be fired again because the nationalists come to power and they're anti-Semitic. So he goes to Rutherford and says, "Can I have my old job back?" Rutherford said, "Love to have you, but you just fought on the wrong side for 4 years." So he came to Copenhagen. We'd been neutral in World War I. The bitterness between the Axis and the Allied powers did not run here. Anybody could come here. And thank goodness he did, because now I realise this story sounds unlikely, but I don't have any evidence to disprove it. I'm as suspicious as you are. He makes his big discovery after working with the spectrograph throughout 1921 and 22, and discovers a whole new element number 72, hafnium. Named after Copenhagen, hafnium is the Latin for harbour. Now, if you believe the story, he sends the telegram up to Stockholm just as Niels Bohr gets his Nobel Prize. But you can't blame me for being a bit suspicious, can you? Hevesy is a really good example, though, of what this openness and this neutrality mean. I have a picture here. I'll get back to why these pictures are here in a little while, but the top row and the second one from the left is from 1936. We're getting close to World War II. On the second row, there are two young men who are effectively stood at Niels Bohr's shoulders. To our right, there's a guy with dark hair and glasses, and his name is Victor Weisskopf. And he eventually goes on to Los Alamos, works as part of the Manhattan Project. Next to him, at Niels Bohr's other shoulder, is Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. Von Weizsäcker, oh hang on a minute, I'll have to put that on the catch for you. Excuse me. Yes, I just need to put it on the catch, otherwise it won't stay open.
Just give a little bit.
Yeah. Von Weizsäcker ends up in Germany working as Werner Heisenberg's assistant, effectively doing the same job for the other side. And if you think that's strange, I have pictures of them in the canteen here together drinking Carlsberg in the old civilized days when we could all have a relaxed afternoon afterwards. This is not unique, and it's not only confined to Europe. Just here we've got this picture of the Buddha with Niels Bohr and his son and his wife and 5 Japanese stood under it. Niels Bohr's on a world tour. All 5 of those Japanese studied here in the early 1920s. And it's worth just parking that thought for 30 seconds and just thinking how much difficulty there was in even getting here. And the culture shock that we cannot imagine in our world today. From, do you want to sit down?
Oh, okay.
You should. And how much culture shock there was when you got here. Of the people in that picture, the Japanese guy furthest to the left in the picture, his name was Yoshio Nishina. He became the father of nuclear physics in Japan. He was also the poor guy that they sent out to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 to find out what just happened there. He took his wife with him as an emergency secretary, and it essentially killed them. In 1951, they died within weeks of each other from various cancers. So this means that this was a life. This picture is from 1937, but Nishina, just before he died, came all the way back to Denmark one last time to see Niels Bohr. It was such an important part of his life. And when he returns to Tokyo, he writes this beautiful letter saying thank you. And the last paragraph says, "I've sailed around the world to be with you, and I've seen the world on the way. We really have one chance now, and that is to work together and work for peace." 1 year later, Niels Bohr took this, expanded on it, because, as I said, Bohr was not often concise, and he wrote a letter to the United Nations saying pretty much the same thing, with some of the same phrases that Nishina uses. It's worth thinking as well that Nishina's laboratory partner when he was here, I actually have 25 seconds of silent film of them working in the laboratory. This guy was called Bidu Bhusan Ray, and he was from India. And he was the first of a whole ream of Indian scientists who came here. We had Chinese scientists too, and in 1937 Niels Bohr takes a world tour where he goes to China, Japan, America, Canada, and meets his old students. And this is true, the roots of nuclear physics in Japan, China, India, and therefore Pakistan, Israel, and the United States can all be found in this institute. The important part of this, to a lot of, for what happens in later history, is best described by these photographs. What I'm going to tell you about now, I have limited resources because every source that would relate to this, Niels Bohr burned in a bonfire in the gardens of the mansion at Carlsberg on the 9th of April 1940 when Denmark was invaded. It will become obvious why. In 1935, the staff got together and were photographed because Niels Bohr was going to turn 50. And they're being photographed just where that guy's sleeping outside right now. And he thought, what a great tradition. So every year since then, right up to the present day, about the 7th of October, we are photographed outside the building to show who's at work in the Institute. During the 1930s, and I mean from about 8 weeks after Hitler wins the election in Germany, then he starts to collect money in with the League of Nations, with Ernest Rutherford and various other scientists for an organisation we call the Academic Assistance Council. This helps people get out of dictatorships and work in safer areas. I cannot tell you how many refugees came from Germany because the evidence is not there. I can tell you the stories of some of them. The best I can give you, to give you an idea of how many people, was my opposite number came from Los Alamos to visit about 5 or 6 years ago, and she said that she thought that out of the Europeans working in Los Alamos during World War II, 75% of them had been through this institute at one time or another. So that's the best you're going to get. But I'm going to tell you 2 stories just to give you an idea of how important it was. The very first picture from 1935, I'm going to pick and bolt from that so it's easier for you. 4th from the left on the front row is a guy with a dark suit and too much haircut. And his name was Otto Frisch. Anybody? No? It's okay, I get Nobel Prize winners in here who've never heard of Otto Frisch. We'll try his aunt, Lisa Meitner.
So it's a German physicist has a kind of
Austrian.
The theory of nucleus. So.
Precisely. Wasn't a man that split the atom, ladies and gentlemen, it was a woman. There was Lisa Meitner, and the story goes like this. She did it here, by the way. In the 1930s, Lisa Meitner was Austrian. She was of Jewish extraction, but she converted to Lutheranism. Third Reich, that didn't matter, you were still Jewish. But she was protected by her Austrian passport because the Nazi racial laws only applied to German citizens. So she continued working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute with her research partner Otto Hahn. Hahn and Meitner worked with a machine called a cyclotron, which usually breaks apart, in popular speech it smashes atoms. You get changed versions of the atom, isotopes. And she and Hahn worked together, but during the course of some of their experiments with uranium, they produced plutonium. Hahn thinks this must be a mistake, and at this point, Lisa, who said, "No, I think the nucleus is pulling apart. We have nuclear fission," has to flee because Germany annexes Austria and Lisa's passport doesn't protect her anymore. So she goes to Sweden. Hahn writes to her in Sweden and said, "Can you do more of these experiments?" We had a cyclotron here. In fact, we, after building a large number of the buildings that you see today, had to dig out a whole cellar to put it in. So for about 6 to 8 months in 1936, the whole of this building was on stilts so that they could have a cellar built for this. She works with her nephew Frisch through the last months of 1938, the first couple of weeks of 1939, writes up the results, copies them, sends one copy down to Germany to Otto Hahn, which is great news for Hahn because in 1944, on the back of those results, Hahn wins the Nobel Prize for Physics. Nazi Germany, 1939, a Jewish lady like Lisa Meitner does not get her name on the paper, never gets a Nobel Prize. And it is to the eternal shame that despite pressure from people like Niels Bohr after the war, the Nobel Committee said the rules are your name must be on the paper. And it was one of the worst scandals in scientific history. What happened to the other copy? Well, Niels Bohr was going to visit Princeton in America, and he went across the Atlantic in January 1939, just after Lisa's finished with these experiments. And he works with this guy on the wall here with the nice grey suit on, whose name was John Wheeler. Wheeler and Bohr work out that what you need for a chain reaction is to produce an isotope of uranium called 235. But they are sure that you cannot do this in the next 25 years with all the cyclotrons at their disposal in order to do anything practical. They turned out to be very wrong. But I have no evidence before the end of the World War II that Niels Bohr knew anything different. He must have got an idea when he turned up at Los Alamos, but I think he got one hell of a shock. So Bohr comes back to Denmark. In the spring of 1940, Denmark is invaded. And that's why all the evidence had to go about these refugees, because it was dangerous to have it. The other refugee I want to pick out is this she's a very beautiful girl. She's on all the top row of pictures, and the picture from 1939. She's got very dark hair, and her name was Hilda Levi. You may not have heard of Hilda, but she was a German Jewish refugee, came here in 1934 with another problem on top of that. Her fiancé dumped her the night before the wedding. His name was Hans Bethe. He was a famous, later Nobel Prize winning physicist and rotter, if you ask me. But he was never invited back to the Institute until after Niels Bohr was dead, so we'll just let that hang in the air. Hilda was taken very much under the Bohr family's wing. She became George Hevesey's assistant and assisted him in the work which won him a Nobel Prize in 1943. She also had to disappear from this institute in 1940 because, as a German citizen, she would have got a one-way ticket back to Germany and to the concentration camps. However, they got a job for her at Carlsberg, at the laboratory I mentioned before, and she worked there because she had a flat just above Carlsberg's laboratory. And Niels Bohr lived at the Carlsberg mansion, so if she needed fresh air, she had Bohr's garden to go out in. She didn't need to be out on the streets. Now, she fled with the rest of the Jewish population in 1943. I'll get back to that in a little while. But after the war, she came back, worked at the Carlsberg laboratory, and Hilda is one of the people who developed carbon-14 dating. And for those of you who aren't from Denmark, just to let you know, in the Iron Age, we used to take people who were dead or going to be that way pretty soon and put their bodies into bogs. These bodies get preserved so perfectly, like leather, that you can see the stubble on guys' faces. Now, Lisa, she dated all these bog bodies that we have from Denmark. There's the Ekville girl, the Galban man, the Tolland man. And she is the person who told us that definitively they were from the Iron Age. She retired in 1979 and then worked as a volunteer for the archive that I work at now. So she's the colleague I never met because I find her notes pretty much everywhere in the archive, at least once a week. And sometimes I'm happy with Lisa, sometimes I'm a bit frustrated at what she's done. And if I've been down the cellar enough hours, I do talk to her. The day she talks back is the day I retire. She died in 2003, and this one does have a happy ending. She was 94 years old, and she was never stupid enough to get engaged again. So there you go. When Germany invaded, the papers referring to the refugees were not the only thing that had to disappear. Our old friend George Hevesy was here, very nervous as a Jewish person to see German soldiers marching down the street. Suddenly realises that there are 2 gold Nobel medals which have been left deposited here. Both belong to German scientists who are now in danger because if you export gold from the Third Reich without telling anybody, you get the death penalty. So they have to disappear. So he shaves them down, he dissolves them in a mixture of nitric and sulfuric acid, which is called aqua regia, the king's water, Königswasser, and that's the 3 languages I can manage for you. And it stays on a shelf here for 7 years. I told you that he was our second Nobel Prize winner. When he escaped Denmark in 1943, it coincided with him winning the Nobel Prize. When you win a Nobel Prize, you are offered Swedish citizenship, and he took it. So he came back as a guest in 1947. He extracted the gold from the solution. The gold was sent up to Stockholm, 2 new medals were minted, and the 2 scientists, Max von Laue and James Franck, got their Nobel Prizes once again in 1950. Now, there will be people amongst you who are thinking, nice story, but come on. Well, I have a tobacco tin that has a little spangly lump, which is rather heavy for the size, and I have the goldsmith's receipt from Copenhagen and George Hevesy's handwritten notes in pencil when he extracted the gold to get the weight right. True without a shadow of a doubt. The first 3 years of the occupation in Denmark were not as brutal as the rest of Europe, but the situation changed dramatically in 1943 and the Jewish population of Denmark was in danger. A sympathetic German who was working in the harbour as harbour master was called Duckwitz, and he informed the Danish authorities that the Germans planned to intern the police, the last armed force in Denmark, and send people transporters to Copenhagen along with the Gestapo to round up the Jewish population. Niels Bohr was one of the first to flee. The message went out on the underground, do not be at home the 29th and 30th of September 1943. 29th of September, Niels Bohr escapes, and the first thing he does when he reaches Sweden in a fishing boat is go to the king in Sweden and the foreign minister there and say, we must let these refugees in. After that, 7,500 of a population of 8,000 Jewish people in Denmark escape across the Sound to Sweden in safety. It's the closest thing to a miracle you will find in history. This includes all of Bohr's family, including his son Bohr, who joins his father in Great Britain. The British Secret Service picked up Bohr after 48 hours in Stockholm, flew him to Great Britain, and Bohr and his son go between America and and Great Britain. I'll get back to that in a second. because there's two members of Bohr's family that don't make it out. The first is his aunt, Ellen Adler. Niels Bohr's mother was Jewish, this is his maternal aunt, she's Jewish. She's rounded up by the Gestapo, put in a police station. However, she was Denmark's first female head teacher. And as that, she had 400 former pupils who lined the road down to the police station until even the Gestapo thought one little old lady is not worth this trouble, and they released her. The other I didn't know about until during lockdown. I was contacted by Niels Bohr's eldest granddaughter Anna, and Anna said, "I have 3 films, they're stamped with the date 1940, are you interested?" A bit. So, I got them digitised, and the first one was just the gardens at Carlsberg and the gardener cutting grapes. The second 2 was baby Anna with the family. So the date 1940 is when they were bought. These films are from 43 because Anna is born in May. And then I remember the first film, Cutting Grapes, September 1943. This means that these are taken days before they flee Denmark, and they have no idea. But Anna can't go, because if a baby cries in the fishing boat, then it's game over. So they had to leave her with friends. Now, I don't know about the mother, I can only imagine, but her grandmother, Margrethe Bohr, Niels' wife, had a nervous breakdown over Christmas, New Year, 1943-4, just because of the stress of this. But in the spring, a friend of theirs who's a surgeon, who's also a member of the resistance, he takes the baby with forged papers saying that the baby, who's got a false name, has a brain tumour, must be operated on in Sweden. She's reunited with her family and officially dies. He comes back alone. So the great thing was that when Anna turned 80 May last year, I sent her a bottle of wine, some chocolates, and a card that said, "For somebody who died in 1944, you're doing very well, I think." Bohr was taken to Great Britain, and it's important to remember he wasn't a member of the Manhattan Project. He worked for the British, for the organisation codenamed Tube Alloys. He observed what the Americans did and reported back to the British. He was also sidelined because he went to Roosevelt and Churchill with his concerns that the Russians were being kept in the dark and that this risked having an arms race. Have a seat. You're looking like you're just about to collapse. There will be an arms race after World War II if we don't tell the Russians. And the thing is that's what a spy never does, is go to the top men and say that. But they kept him out of the main organisation after that. So when the bombs were tested, when the bombs were used, he was back in Great Britain. And they didn't allow him back into Denmark until after the bombs had been used. When he gets back to Denmark, it's so typical. The press run up and say, "What about your bomb, Professor Bohr?" He said, "Oh, they didn't need my help." "Well, tell us something interesting then." He said, "Okay, my name's Niels, but my little brother Harold used to play football for Denmark." Which is true, Harold Bohr was on the national team in 1908. Anyway, the rest of Niels Bohr's life is pretty much being the first citizen of Denmark. There is no official title of that. My newspaper cuttings collection for 1900 to 1940 is like this. If it was 1945 to 62, I'd have to move you, all of you, open both doors and just put it in a line. The fake news is brilliant. You get headlines like, "Bohr used the atom bomb in Copenhagen." It's still there. "Bohr kept heavy water in a Carlsberg bottle." Again, not true, but that's morphed into the myth that Niels Bohr had a beer tap that went all the way from Carlsberg to his house, which I'm afraid is not true. Somebody ought to make one. And I have pictures of him meeting Pandit Nehru from India, Winston Churchill, Queen Elizabeth II, President Eisenhower, and Louis Armstrong. Armstrong and Bohr had something in common that no other human beings ever had. They were both honorary members of the Danish Students' Union. There's only ever been two. And they got their award after Armstrong played a concert in 1959 in Copenhagen. And the headline under the photograph of them together said, Niels Bohr knows as much about jazz as Louis Armstrong does about nuclear physics. When he died in 1962, his son Bohr took over the leadership of the Institute, and he continued until 1970. Then he wanted to research, and it was in 1975 that Bohr and his research partner, Ben Mottelson, won the Nobel Prize for Physics for their work with the structure of the nucleus. There's two Bohrs at the Institute today. There is Elliot Bohr, who works on the quantum clock, and there is Emil Bjørn Bohr, who works at the Niels Bohr International Academy. A couple of years ago I was giving a lecture and some people came up and were really, really nice to me afterwards. And then I recognised the facial traits and I said, wait, Bohr family, yeah? Yes. Two of them were pregnant, so we're not going to run out of them anytime soon. Now, it's getting really warm in here, ladies and gentlemen. I can see some of you flagging. Please take all the photographs you'd like. I'd love to have taken you in Auditorium A today, but as you can see, there's a guy outside, and they're having a rather special, I think we've got a couple of ministers from the Danish government there today, so we're not going to get in. I can only ever reserve this room, so if any of you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. And I'll do my best to answer them. You know, Niels Bohr based questions. I don't know what the weather's going to be like on Saturday. The only thing I ask is, this is a free tour, but I like your names and what country and where you came from, and comments like, that guy should be paid twice as much as he actually is. Start with you.